the whole background or the idea of dharmikism was triggered in my head when a British friend once asked me a very simple question. He said, "Look, Anurag, I haven't seen any other society where wealth is worshipped. Where you have a concept of Lakshmi. How come India is socialist then?" Now, if you think about it, this is a very serious and a deep question. No other country from their cultural or religious roots has the idea of Lakshmi or wealth actually built into their archetype or into their civilizational or cultural framework. India has always had that. So at which point did we decide to become socialist or communist? So the way he said it is, ki, Anurag, where did you guys lose your way? And I thought that was a very important question, which got me started on this path. Now, we all know, if you look at, so the world fundamentally, in terms of recent history, the last couple of centuries, had two primary concepts: capitalism and communism. Communism in its original format has already failed. Now, China might claim it is communist, but it really isn't. Capitalism, although is very successful, capitalism is premised on having one winner and 99 losers. That is the fundamental idea of capitalism. So if you look at the US, which is supposed to be the fountainhead of capitalism as we know it today, the whole Occupy Wall Street movement was about the 99% people saying that, hey, listen, this doesn't work for us anymore. Right? As nations rise and fall, there's an opportunity to rethink models, not just on economics, but on multiple areas, and present those models. Right? Now, why is this the time to talk about the idea of dharmikism or India's own indigenous economic model? You see, we are seeing the downsides of every other economic, cultural, or social model, right? Brexit has shown that UK's political or economic dominance is not sustainable, right? The US-China trade war is only going to intensify after this COVID situation. The European Union, which when founded, was founded because it brought strength together. Now, member states of the EU are questioning, is it really worth us being in here or not? You look at all the multilateral agencies. Just yesterday, or rather earlier today, our time in Asia, Donald Trump announced that their funding, the US funding to WHO, would be seized. A couple of years back, US and Israel walked out of UNESCO. So we see a steady decline in the value and stature of multilateral agencies. The point I'm making is, a lot of institutions, structures, and ideas from the last century are now getting destroyed, which means there is space for new institutions, there is space for new ideas, there is space for new values to replace the vacuum that is being created. Right? Now, look at, so the whole idea of dharmikism, as I propose it, is for India to ambitiously create a new economic model. And this is a very, very ambitious plan, right? For India to create and present a new economic model, which is an alternative to any model that exists currently, right? Now, why am I saying that it is an alternate economic model? How is it different from capitalism? How is it different from communism? So just a few thoughts on that. Giridharji and I are chartered accountants. For those of you who run businesses or who have worked for businesses, especially if you deal with Marwadis, Jains, Banyas, etc., that the idea of Shubh Labh, which is prosperity and profit, always have coexisted. Right? The whole idea that profit is not pariah, but it is the reason of human endeavor. The reason we are all putting an effort is to create something of value, is very intrinsic to our Indic ideology, right? you look at the whole idea of Riddhi Siddhi, which is expertise and success, always coexisted. Riddhi cannot exist without Siddhi, Siddhi cannot exist without Riddhi. We have learnings like these which are intrinsic not just in our ancient text, but they're part of our cultural DNA. People who do not know the roots of Shubh Labh and Riddhi Siddhi still follow it because they apply it in their day-to-day business, day-to-day living. Right now, look at it historically. In 1863, uh, Charles Cook wrote very interestingly about India's thriving banking system. Now, this was in pre-colonial India, right? So he wrote about the strength of India's banking system and how it has been constantly attacked or eaten away for, to enable Britishers to rule India monetarily, right? Dadabhai Moroji wrote Poverty of India a few years later, where he actually has documented how British institutions, many of whom were not as superior as existing Indian institutions, so how these British institutions were forcefully destroying institutions to create space for themselves. Now, this wasn't the first time that India was a victim to colonizers or mercenaries or whatever. We know the bloody history, the very bloodied, violent onslaught that we have had to face, right? I give this example to a lot of people. Christopher Columbus set out originally to look for India, which is why it is West Indies, and the Native Americans were called Indians and things like that. Now, the claim that is made, the history that is taught to Europeans, was that Christopher Columbus was kind of on he was going out to spread the word of God, right? And that Christianity should reach all four corners of the world, etc., etc. Now, very interestingly, and I'd like you all to Google it up if this interests you. In the letter that Christopher Columbus wrote seeking permission and funds to go out on this quest, he has mentioned the word Lord and God only once. However, he has mentioned the word gold 17 times. So think about it for a second. Forget whatever narrative Western historians have built today. Christopher Columbus, when he said, I want to look for India, he said 17 times that, boss, I'm going to find gold over there. And that is the kind of economic might India used to have, following our traditional principles that I call dharmakism, right? Now, he was not successful, but the British and the Mughals were. For centuries, and there's no easier word to say it, but for centuries, they literally looted India. They filled their coffers, right? And it has continued for a very long time. The economic onslaught, a little later, post-independence, got replaced later by an intellectual onslaught, right? So you had Marxism develop. Marxism has never been about creating value. Marxism has always been about distributing value. Karl Marx never ever in his life talked about how value should be created, right? In fact, it was very interesting. Karl Marx's mother made a very interesting observation, a public statement about him. So Karl Marx's book was called Das Kapital. And she once said that, I wish Karl, instead of just talking about capital, would earn it. Now, that is, if your mother finds holes or issues with your logic, you can imagine how flawed that logic was to begin with, right? But anyway, the intellectual onslaught started, and we know about the Macaulayization of history and the Marxism and this and that and whatever it is. But the interesting thing is, all these lenses have been Western lenses. They haven't been local Indic lenses. And some of it has resulted in what I believe are the biggest misinformation scams that unwittingly we have been subject to. Take the whole case of Hindu rate of growth. There is nothing like Hindu rate of growth, but that lie has been repeated to us so many times that we have internalized it and started believing it. Right? It's a self-deprecation to the nth degree. So what has happened is, to summarize, there is, and within a couple of sentences, I will stop about the historical aspects, right? So the fact that India was one of the world's largest economy is not disputed. The fact that Christopher Columbus or the Mughal invaders or the British wanted to get to India primarily for its wealth is also not it's not disputed. The fact that post them giving away, we have forgotten this economic DNA. We have forgotten the pride that we should be taking. And we have started looking ourselves using a Western lens is also clear now, right? My proposal of dharmikism is to say that let us get rid of all these shackles. Let us get rid of this Western lens and let us see if there are any learnings from our own past that we can reapply to ourselves today and re-emerge as an economic superpower that we used to be before we were invaded. Now, let's look at a couple of, so it's very interesting. Every time I talk to somebody who's who's in the Silicon Valley, or you have people who run startups, you have venture capitalists, you have people that provide seed capital, etc., etc. There are some very interesting things you notice about this set of people. These are the hip and cool population that you have around the world, especially in Silicon Valley. Right now, if you look deep within, so I think at a superficial level, there are a lot of practices that many of them are adopting. The whole idea about mindfulness, whether it is turmeric latte, whether it is veganism, whether it is yoga. So all these things are, in a way, superficial adaptations of our ancient wisdom. But if you dig down a little deeper into how their minds are wired, how is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur fundamentally thinking differently from people around him, right? The whole journey of an entrepreneur is that of seeking, is that of pursuit, what we would call sadhana in our terms, right? The whole idea of Advaita is very, very deeply entrenched into you see, companies don't describe themselves as companies anymore. There is a difference in the way a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller built their fortune and how current billionaires are building their fortune. Everybody considers themselves a part of an ecosystem with components or players that are interdependent on each other, right? Look at how HR practices are being followed nowadays. All of this very deeply internalizes the whole idea. You see, the whole word ecosystem can be, the whole idea of interdependence or ecosystems can be rooted to the whole idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Right? But more importantly, the idea, and this is where I would like you to think, I'm assuming all of you are in your 40s or 50s. I would like you to think of even 15, 20 years back of the typical Nehruvian Marxist economic concept we all grew up with. It was always about command and control, right? It was never about individual pursuit. Today's wealth creator are not about command and control at all. They are about freedom, they are about choices, they are about building interdependence and codependence to create wealth together, right? You see, a lot of these startup guys keep talking about, monetization and asset utilization and fancy terms like that, right? Now, if you look at the whole idea of monetization, what is monetization? That I will take a product or a process which is worth X rupees and I will make 2X rupees out of it. That's the whole idea of monetization. Within the Western world, the whole idea of monetization itself is relatively new. It was coined within our lifetimes. But look at what Chanakya said centuries back. He said, in the absence of fruitful economic activity, both current prosperity and future growth are in danger of destruction. I'll say that again. In the absence of fruitful economic activity, both current prosperity and future growth are in danger of destruction. Right? Now think about somebody ages back who is saying that the whole idea of prosperity is fundamentally an economic pursuit. The whole idea of future is dependent on being able to create wealth today, right? Similarly, you have the whole phrase asset utilization, right? You see banks and companies nowadays are talking about utilization rates, this, that, whatever it is. Again, Chanakya ages back said, the value of land is what man makes of it. Think about it. For somebody to have the insight to say that land per se has no value, it is just a flat slab of mud lying somewhere. To understand that land had value, and that value was what humans are made of it, is a very, very deep insight, which is a relatively newer insight into the Western mindset. Right? And of course, he laid down very, very rules for taxation and things like that, and about being fair, just, etc. And laid down rules for how the government would not just collect tax, but also the application of that tax. Right? All these ideas are very, very, very advanced for the time that they were coined. Right? You look at our ancient texts again, right? And again, I end up comparing West versus India simply because it is a great one-to-one comparison, right? If you ask any pure capitalist or a PhD or whatever in the US or Europe or Russia or Middle East or wherever, you ask them what is wealth. They'll say, oh, wealth is money. Wealth is assets. There is land. If I have land, if I have a factory, if I have vehicles, if I have cash in the bank, if I have bars of gold, that is all wealth. Wealth has been a unidimensional perspective within capitalist and communist frameworks. Within the Dharmikism framework, there are 8 different types of wealth that we always knew about. So Adi Lakshmi was primary wealth, right? There was also Dhana Lakshmi, Dhanya Lakshmi, Veera Lakshmi, right? Santana Lakshmi, Aishwarya Lakshmi. So the fact that wealth is not just about money, but it is about the security of food grain. That there is specifically a wealth of courage, Veera Lakshmi, right? There is Santana Lakshmi, the wealth of offspring. You see, none of these kinds of wealth, right? The fact that you have courage, the fact that you have security in your food grain, the fact that you have affluence, the fact that you have victory, Vijay Lakshmi as an example is the wealth of victory. All of these are non-monetary wealths, but they are wealths. Now, with companies realizing that unidimensional dollar measures are not enough ways of measuring a company's success, Sridhar Vembu wrote a very good response to, I think, Fortune or whatever, which is also available online. When they said we'd want to rank you in top 50 and this and that, he said, no, I mean, it is, you have a unidimensional measure, right? Which is how much money do I have? That's only a small part of what we are creating here. We are creating a lot of other things, right? Now, why is this whole idea of wealth important, of many types of wealth? Because from here, you derive the whole idea of corporate social responsibility as we always knew it, versus an alien idea, which is, you pay your 2%, your job is done, right? The whole idea of dana, the whole idea of punya kamana, you see, the whole idea of punya kamana is no different from the carbon credits that we hear of nowadays, right? What is punya kamana? I am doing something which is somehow either hurting the planet or the ecology or my community or whatever else. To offset that, I need to do some good for the same community, for the same society, for the planet. I will plant trees. I will build a dharmshala. I will build a school. I will donate to a temple, etc., etc. Right? Because of this cultural understanding of dharmikism, which nobody needed to teach us, much before the whole Greta Thunberg and this and that happened, much before carbon credits and ecological consciousness and all of that, you had the Chipko movement happening in India, which is to say that this tree is an integral part of my life. To cut that tree, you will have to go over my dead body. That that to me is true CSR, right? Versus Western companies who will donate amount to an NGO and say our responsibility for CSR is done. Indian companies that were rooted in our dharmic DNA, they have built townships, they have built hospitals, they have built schools, right? None of us, and I challenge you, none of us would have spent our lives not being a recipient or a beneficiary of some kind of institution or program or social benefit which has been built by truly Indian corporates. That's the impact that traditional Indian CSR has had, right? You see, I always talk about the example of Akshay Patra. You see, Akshay Patra is a brilliant example. It's the world's largest soup kitchen and runs without government support, without this, that, without even calling it as CSR, right? We need to remember that these existed in our cultural DNA for thousands of years before the word or phrase CSR was even coined, right? You see, even a small, we have Buddi or Kottu or Pansari or whatever you call it, right? A small grocery fellow, especially in North India, they'll have a small matka, a pot outside their shop with a glass on it. Why? Any passerby who's feeling very hot in the summer, he's getting dehydrated, he can drink a glass of water and go. If nothing, people will put out a bowl of rice or roti or whatever for a crew to eat. These things don't have to be taught to us through a Western lens. These things are intrinsically and internally a part of our DNA, right? Now, shifting gears a little bit, we have talked about the history of Dharmikism in India. We have talked about how we were invaded because Dharmikism was successful. We have compared it to the emerging Western way of thought, which is very, very recent, startups, tech companies, etc., etc. You look at the traditional Western economic model, right? Across the US and Western Europe, unemployment is at the highest today. Wages are stagnant. Work conditions are inhumane. You look at China, who's emerging as an economic power. That level of inhumanity is unsustainable in the long term. Right? You talk to an average friend who's in the US or UK or Western Europe, they will tell you that they're in so much of student debt and household debt and car debt and all, it's not even funny. Right? Like I said in the beginning, 99% of capitalist society today is literally living mouth to mouth. If a paycheck doesn't come for 2 months or 3 months, those families have the likelihood of going bankrupt. The last 1 month, I think, saw the unemployment numbers in the US go up 6x to unsustainable levels. Right? Now, why does this happen? There is quarter-to-quarter pressure. There is a single, a single unit of measurement, right? There is no long-term view. Right? Every CEO is thinking about performance, not even on a yearly or quarterly term, on a monthly term. Why? Because the board is demanding, the stock market is demanding, etc., etc. Right? Financial markets, who are themselves dying, is not able to support companies that are also dying. Right? Very recently, you would have heard, and again, all of this new thought is emerging from the Silicon Valley. You've heard of concepts like conscious capitalism and impact investing and giving pledge, which Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have started, and things like that. All of these, the fact that people feel that they have to somehow make up for the damage that they're causing to the society and the earth, is, in my view, some kind of a guilt-ridden approach. It is to say that, hey, listen, I'm actually doing something or somebody some harm. So let me be a conscious capitalist, right? Or I'm putting my money in terrible places, so let me get into impact investing, right? Or, oh, I've made so much money, whether I deserve it or not is besides the point. So I have to sign up to a giving pledge to give it to the less fortunate. Not thinking about, hey, you created the less fortunate in the first place, right? So across the world, you can see that the whole, so if you look at Keynes, the whole idea of capitalism was premised on Keynes's learning. So he had this whole idea of animal spirit. Now we can see this whole animal spirit is becoming a little more human. It is not, people are saying, hey, we don't have to be cutthroat. We don't have to think in terms of zero game, that for me to win, you have to lose. All these ideas are now taking root, even in purely capitalist economies, right? So where does that leave India? And with this, I would like to conclude in another 3-4 minutes or so. You see, nations or political boundaries are formed with brute force. You and I wage a war. I am more powerful than you. I kill more of your people than you kill of mine. Therefore, your piece of land becomes my piece of land. Over ages, we draw a boundary somewhere, we set up a UN, we legitimize that line on the sand and say, oh, this is a nation. So nations have always been about brute force, right? Civilizations, on the other hand, are formed on the basis of ideas. Now, if we need our civilization to re-emerge, we need our ideas to take root. Right? I'll give you a couple of simple examples. You can peek into your own experiences or your children's experiences or whatever it is. The USA today is considered very cool and hip, right? Why? Because their idea was a cultural idea which they have exported to the rest of the world, right? Cultural idea in terms of Hollywood movies, in terms of jeans and t-shirts, in terms of the food that we like to eat, our kids like to eat. All of these are cultural ideas. The USA has been able to export those cultural ideas and has been able to establish itself because of that. You look at the UK as an example. Forget where they are today, but over the last 200 years, they have been able to export their model of governance. So their idea was, this is how you govern a society. That governance model through the Commonwealth, etc., remnants of that continue till today. The idea still that they exported was that of governance, right? You look at countries like Germany and Korea and Japan and Taiwan, they're relevant today because what is their idea? Their idea is that of the professional work ethic, right? If I have to say it in our words, the whole idea of, let's say, Kshatriyata or Purusharth in economic terms or in work terms has been exported by Japan and Germany and so on and so forth. So you see, the point I'm making is USA gained its power from a cultural idea. UK from an idea of governance. Germany, Japan from the idea of professionalism, right? My submission is that it's time for India to also create and invest and export in an idea of our own. You see, a whole bunch of people on this side and that side of the political horizon keep talking about idea of India, idea of India, idea of India. But what really is the idea of India, right? In my view, the economic model, which is based on sustainability, which is based on fairness, which is based on long-term profits, which is based on profits, which is based around people, is an idea whose time has come. It is the idea for which the world, if you look at the gaps of capitalism and communism, the things that turn people off the most against capitalism are resolved if we take ancient economic ideas from India, right? Now, I'm not saying that we should blindly take principles from 500 years back or 5,000 years back and just blindly reapply them today. But I believe that there is a lot of learning that can be made, right? So let me, so we have an opportunity to pick and choose is my point, right? Let's take a few areas where on how dharmikism is different from capitalism and communism, or rather the disadvantages of capitalism or communism that is being solved because of dharmikism, right? In capitalism, you have the risk takers who create wealth for themselves. In communism, you don't have risk takers at all. What does Dharmikism say? Dharmikism says, we need wealth creators, we need people who take risks, right? But they create wealth for themselves and society. Where capitalism and communism are extreme ends of individual rights versus community rights. Dharmikism is never about rights at all. It is not about me saying what I want from the world. It is about individual responsibility. It is about saying what is my responsibility as a businessman, as a farmer, as a wealth creator to society. Right? Versus a culture of consumption that the West is focused on. Dharmikism focuses on preservation. All the green ecology, climate change warriors today would find a model to which preservation is central. They would find this model so exciting if it is presented to them in the right format. Right? Now, Dharmikism has always been about free market. So nobody is saying that you should go back into command and control, socialist kind of this thing. Right? But the idea of free market is, there is a free market for me to truly create value, extract it, to be able to fulfill my dharma or to be able to fulfill my responsibilities. That is the ultimate aim. Not just saying that my net worth is so much, your net worth is so much. Right? Money as a measurement is perhaps a very archaic concept. Right? Think about how much the world would change, and I'm not trying to be very kind of bohemian or utopian here. Think of how much the world would change if your net worth was measured in the amount of blessings you got, not how much money you had in the bank. Now, that might sound like a very extreme concept to many, but if you see what Bill Gates is doing today or what Warren Buffett is doing today, that's essentially what they are doing today. They're saying, look, I have my money. This money is meaningless by itself. Let me see what good I can create out of it, which is fundamentally a very dharmic view. Right. So the whole idea is to incentivize people to invest, to do business, to earn money, to grow, to do all the things that capitalism asks for, but with a trusteeship focus, rather than with a greed and a focus of appropriation. The fundamental difference between, let's say, capitalism and dharmikism is, capitalism only believes in a zero-sum game, right? That there is totally so much money on the table. Either you get to keep it or I get to keep it. If I have to win, you have to lose. Dharmikism doesn't believe in a zero-sum game. Dharmikism is fundamentally expansionist in the assumption, going back to the statement of Kautilya, that a human being can create value out of land or anything for that matter. Right? More importantly, for us as Indians, I would say it's a very important time for us to recognize. Now we're coming out of poverty, we're coming out of a command and control economy. There's enough food to feed people. There's enough, so we've taken care of all the basic humanitarian needs. Now it is time for us to acknowledge higher order needs or intellectual needs, to say that, look, we can evolve as a nation or we can evolve as a civilization only if we recognize the continuity. Right? See, in the long history of time, 100, 200, 300 years is nothing. Right? Unless we recognize that there is an ancient wisdom, there is an ancient cultural rooting, there are cultural and economic and business practices which we need to build continuity, which we need to continue on for us to unlock our true potential. Unless that happens, we will internally not be able to, India will not be able to be that Vishwaguru or Soni Ki Chidiya that it deserves to be. At the same time, we lose the whole opportunity to presenting an alternative to the world, given that the current alternatives anyway doesn't work. So I just submit in all of this, that if we really want to be Vishwaguru, if we really want ourselves as an economy or as a society to grow, the only way to do it is to recognize the whole idea of dharmikism and to internalize it in our laws, our taxation system, our way of working, and then export it to the rest of the world. With that, I end my comments back to Giridharji. Thank you so much for patiently listening to me. Now I'm more than open to any thoughts, questions, whatever you might have.
Yeah, thanks for the initial comments, Anuragji. The concepts that you are espousing, suppose we superimpose them on today's economic scenario specifically, and then we try and see how the differences pan out. Let's say, for instance, for argument's sake, let's say we take about the doles that the government of India is giving, right? Free this, free that, whatever. Your food subsidies, your Manrega, whatnot. There are so many things we are giving free, right? But that was not the concept envisaged by, let's say, Kautilya. The intervention of the state was only in terms of endemics, pandemics, or emergencies. Otherwise, the market forces were left alone, and the state was only concerned about the safety and security. True. So, how do you view these from a Dharmicism point of view in what's happening today?
You see, okay, that's a very interesting question. That, in fact, let me rephrase and expand that question. That what does the practical implication of Dharmikism look like? Right. Now, take a couple of areas. Look at taxation. Right. Historically, and I'm literally quoting from text. Right. The whole idea of tax was to be like the honeybee that sucks nectar from a flower. You look at the taxation system we have today. I know of businesses that have to be shut down. I know of businessmen that end up paying from their own pockets, etc., etc. The amount of taxation, B, the delivery. We've all heard about tax terrorism, tax jihad. All these things are reality. It is nowhere. Rather than being a honeybee, they've become locusts, which destroys the flower and the crop and the plant and the field itself. So that could be one example. Second example, if you, like I mentioned, the whole idea of role of the government. Right? The government was supposed to govern, business was supposed to do business. The clarity was very, very clear, exactly as you mentioned. Again, I don't say I have all the answers and what is right or not right. I see no reason. You look at, in fact, in my view, Margaret Thatcher followed Dharmikism more than we have followed it. Why? Because she stood up and said, boss, it's not the government's job to run trains. It's not the government's job to, get food to your table or run airplanes or run restaurants or whatever it is. So we will slowly get out of that so we can redirect our effort towards governing better. Right. And leave all this to private enterprise, which again, take India's example. Private enterprise has historically been way more efficient than public enterprise. Public enterprise has the ability to do good because taxpayers fund it. There is no case where, there is no case where the public enterprise is actually more efficient than a private enterprise. Take the whole example of, let's say, the relative importance or roles of various creators, right? The whole idea of nuance or artistry has gone away because of pushing for mass manufacturing, because of pushing to a factory model, etc., which is therefore then leading to urbanization, right? And you see, urbanization per se is not a bad word. But, let's use the example of Hyderabad. Hyderabad, around the time I used to know it, the city used to end at Banjara Hills, Jubilee Hills, which is why Secret Lake was called Secret Lake to begin with, right? You have brought in people from all over the country, to first set up High Tech City, then Gachibowli, then Nallagantla, and then now Sarlingampelli. It's grown all over the place. Nothing which exists in Hyderabad could not have existed in a smaller town or in a distributed fashion, right? People move from a village to a town, and again in the COVID crisis, we are seeing the worst elements of this, right? half of the risk is created. Of course, there are some people who want to go spit on others and willingly subject themselves and put others to risk, which is a bigger cultural issue. But from an economic perspective, all these people from Bihar and UP and Odisha that have, that were in Delhi, Bombay, etc., were there because of unhindered urbanization. Why? Because we did not internalize the whole philosophy of rural economies, right? Why did that happen? Because, when the British came in, they said that, so they used to go to churches. Churches was a place of worship, right? It was a religious building to them. So they went to a temple and they said, oh, temple also is a religious building. Right? Temple was never meant to be a religious building alone. There were gurukuls there. There were cases that were adjudicated there. Arbitration used to happen. There used to be a weekly, monthly market. It used to be the center for arts, performance, teaching, etc., etc. Temple was a community center, not a religious center, right? Now you've taken that away from the community and you've given it to the government, who are following a Britisher's definition of a temple, and they've made it only into a religious place. The whole rural economy has broken. People have no money. What will they do? They have to come to the center and they'll become your driver, your cleaner and your cook and so on and so on. Right? So there are a lot of principles at a fiscal level, at an economic level, at an urban development level that can be reapplied. What we need to first figure out is, are we ambitious enough to do that or not? I don't know if that answers your question, Giridharji.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it addresses a certain angle to it. The other one I'm looking at is, I think our civilizationally, we have gone from being one of the world's best known urban civilization to breaking away from the urbanized world into a rural setup. See, after the Mohenjo-daro, Harappa major cities, we dispersed into the smaller villages with the same cultural edifice carried back to the villages, right? Now there is a huge urge to do the reverse of it, right? Bring people like what you said from Bihar, UP into urban conglomerates. And today the pandemic has really pushed the whole structure into a very bad shape. Probably Japan has managed to some extent stave off people in their villages, take the technology into the villages and not bring the people into the cities, right? I think we look back at even the drainage management that we had in those cities. I don't think we have managed anything close to that in any city in the world today.
Yeah.
So somewhere I think the way we connected with town planning and environmental issues, this was something which I think it needs a serious revisit. And we somehow need to again look at how do we empower our villages, how do we go back to the villages and decongest the cities. After all, in the past 20-25 days, each house is a village in a way. I mean, we are locked in and then you're getting all the services, right? So why can't this happen? The ancient wisdom of not having to live in major cities, but then take the entire culture into the smaller villages is something which probably, that's a concept you want to speak about. The whole idea is there is collectivism versus, individually I'm going to prosper versus collective good of everybody. That's what I'm trying to say.
You hit the nail on the head, sir. That is exactly the key. To recognize that I as an individual is irrelevant or cannot prosper unless people around me prosper. You see, I'll give you a simple example of relative. So there's a very interesting book called The Coming Anarchy by Kenichi Ohmae. Now, that book says that, and Kenichi Ohmae, of course, is one of the biggest social thinkers and consultants and economists. He said that violence or social unrest does not happen because of poverty. It happens because of relative poverty. If you and I are both poor, okay, I'm just giving an example. you and I and say Raghu Garu are all poor. All of us are happy. We are there with each other. Evening we'll sit, we'll play cards, we'll sit under the banyan tree, we'll tell stories to each other, we'll go home. Now, Raghu Garu becomes rich, which is actually true. You and I will sit and develop negative emotions towards Raghu Garu. Right? You and I will say, what the heck, this, that, whatever. And that is where violence stems from. Now, I saw this example when I was living in Mumbai. I was living in Hiranandani. Next to Hiranandani, on one side, there is a slum, in the Vikhroli side. On the other side, there is Chandivali, which is a middle class kind of society. There was no problem in Vikhroli, Chandivali, whatever, till Hiranandani came in between. Now, Hiranandani was this, you have lots of offices there, relatively richer people stay there kind of thing. The minute Hiranandani came up, violence started, chain snatching started, robbery started in houses, etc., etc. Till then, people living around were not unhappy with who they were. Now, the whole idea of dharmikism, in my view, is to be able to recognize that individual prosperity is not sustainable. It is just not sustainable, which is a reality. And except that businessmen realize that when by the time they come to the age of 60, 65, 70, whatever it is, the society is realizing it. I mean, the whole green movement or climate change movement is premised on a simple realization that our kind of capitalism, forget communities or cities or even countries, the world itself is failing. It doesn't matter how much money you have in your bank account if we all go up in flames. So I think very good points raised there, sir.
Yeah, I think the concept that Chanakya espoused was Artha, Kama and Moksha. All three cannot be earned unless it is backed by Dharma.
Correct. Absolutely.
So that is the concept that he spoke about. So this we apply it in the economic context, right? This concept of spardha, what we say, in the current capitalistic thing, that it's an unsustainable competition where I kill somebody and somebody kills me.
Yeah.
Instead, I respect that the dharma tells me that I have to respect the right of everyone to grow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. That's a concept I think is what ultimately needs to be looked at.
Absolutely, sir.
And I think, see, then another one is like the concept of insurance, for instance. Insurance and social security, these concepts are all stemming from the experience of non-community based individuals coming together in a country like USA. They passed on the risk factors to the government or the insurance companies. Whereas in a country like India, our family structures, our community structures, you call it caste structures or whatever it is, these were the protecting layers for us.
Absolutely.
So, the very concept of your dharmic way of life ensured a lot of security to us, internal security. So I think somewhere we need to bring this into monetary terms, and then probably India would not be considered as poor as what they want to look at it as. The balance sheet that is prepared of any country is driven by the Western concept, Western models, whereas these intrinsic value and dharmic systems of the country are not really monetized. Isn't it?
True, absolutely. In fact, I'll give you a very recent example. Tirupur has a huge, textile manufacturing industry. Now, something that I got involved with very, very recently, a few days back. You have small business owners there that run ancillary services to these textile manufacturers. For example, you have tempo, you have people that run tempos, right? So they buy 6 to 8 or 10 tempos, they hire a few people, and they keep running these tempos on shift to deliver, you know, thread and buttons and boxes and thermocol and this and that. Now, all their earning has gone down to zero since this lockdown started. However, this fellow has to pay EMI on that tempo. He has to pay a salary to the drivers, etc., etc. He stood up and said, boss, he went to the bank and said, look, I cannot pay you anymore. So you want to take repossession of the tempos, please do it. Anyway, I'm not earning money. These manufacturers, they got together. They said, boss, we will pool in money because the bank is not willing to help you. Government is not willing to help you. Nobody is willing to help you, but our community will help you. We will give you the money to pay the EMIs, to pay the salaries, not for your family, but just so that you do not go bankrupt. 2, 3, 4 months later, when our production starts again, you cut it from our bill for the next 6 months. Right? Now, no form of economics will account for behavior like this. Yeah. However, this is part of our cultural DNA. You don't need Adam Smith or John Maynard Keynes to tell you to do this. You do this because it is a part of dharma. You do this because you understand coexistence. You do this because you understand interdependence. You do this because you understand the idea of seva, swadhyaya. Right? So you're absolutely right. It is inseparable from us. It is just, you know, so many businessmen tell me that from a business practices point of view, they're following good old dharmic practices. From an accounting perspective, they're following whatever Western principles they have to follow. Yeah. Right. On the new year, on the first day, you go and put 1 rupee in the account of whoever you believe in.
Yeah. God account.
Fit to God account. Yeah, all those practices are still there. Yeah. We just have to recognize that reality as a nation and say that is who we are. We will accept who we are. We don't need to be a Xerox copy of some other country in the West.
Yeah, even the concept of NPA, for instance, like what you said, quarter on quarter, you are bound to show whatever growth and all. So the moment you cross that 180 days threshold or whatever it is, you are pushed into an NPA, irrespective of the fact that businesses can have cycles, which need not be annual cycles. It could be 2-3 year cycles as well. Sometimes they dip, sometimes they go up. That is what we saw in a couple of episodes that have happened in the last 6 years. Demonetization, for instance. It was the Hindu dharma, the basic dharma, which protected this country during that time. People didn't pay cash, but they said, okay, it's okay. We will, we will live with it. You don't have to pay cash. We can take it once the cash liquidity picks up, right? So similarly, during this COVID crisis also, governmental efforts, we don't know how successful they are, but almost everybody is coming and giving something. They're feeding somebody, they're donating something, they're giving free food to people. So that kind of an automatic community responsibility is something which is ingrained in us. That needs to be monetized. What I'm saying is this has to be brought out in economic terms, in value terms, in terms of the way we live, the way we run our economy. That is wholesomely missing. I think you're muted.
Yeah. Just got unmuted. Yeah, totally agree, sir. Absolutely agree with all your points.